any time is a good time to join. So I'll do my usual. The rule of thumb is that I am not John Cogswell. I will never be John Cogswell. I'm not attempting to be John Cogswell. I've just learned a lot from him and wanted to honor his work and his teaching by working my way through this book to see what else I could learn remotely through his words, because I've had a lot of classes with him, but since he's retired, I'm hoping that his information keeps getting passed down by way of his students. So I'm trying to do that. I strongly urge people to own the book. You all have seen me say that in multiple ways, and we will be using the hardcover book as a reference pointer, which seems to have had only one edition or was reprinted exactly the same. So everybody seems to be okay catching up on pages when I denote pages in the hardcover book. And what else? I'm forgetting all kinds of things because I don't have my cheat sheet in front of me. Let me open last session's cheat sheet and see if I can be reminded. We do have a Rio Grande code for getting some discounts, and that is where's my file? Is last registration session. That Cogswell code, the Rachel Morris code, not the Cogswell code, is going to get posted in chat, and you can put that in even if you have others in your Rio account already. That is useful to get you moved into the pro level of pricing for most items for 6 months. It does take a day or two. So if you have things that you've got in your cart, you may want to get it set up and wait until it comes through. And you can always re-up it if you're still working with me in 6 months, and we'll go from there. Workshops. I have one workshop scheduled at present, and that is the upcoming Bezels Less Ordinary at the end of October. You can find information about it on my website, and we're going to play around with some variations on things, expanding on what it was covered in chapter 3 of John's stuff, but also a couple other settings. And what else do I need to tell you? Oh, I've got a tentatively scheduled February in-person workshop coming up in Portland, which will be on introductory waxworking techniques. No casting, just the actual waxworking. We'll be working in soft and hard wax. So if anybody wants to swing by Portland, that'll be only 7 spaces for students in that one. So when it opens up, it'll be through the Creative Metal Arts Guild out here. And I'll let people know closer to that when it gets set up for registration. Other than that, you can see me in shows on the West Coast for the rest of this season, also up on my website, and there may be an East Coast show if I come off waitlist. I feel like that's generally what I cover at the beginning. Did I miss anything, gang? Oh yeah, the Facebook group. I'm going to post all of the links. As a reminder, it's not a very active Facebook group, but it is where I post some of the resources that people bring up, and you can ask questions there. You can show off your work there, and there's a whole bunch of links in there for people to go looking at. And I think that covers the general intro. So without further ado, let's take a peek at where we left off. Got to bring up the right camera. So we left off with the teardrop, the pear shape that we were doing is in the tumbler to get it polished, because I did not get a chance to do that, and we're going to set that later today. But in the meantime, we had gotten involved in the, I got to spotlight myself. Hang on. Spotlight. I have not fully caught up with my brain post-COVID, so bear with me, gang. So we'd started on this this cushion cut rather, because I didn't have a square of decent size to set, or a rectangle of decent size. And so when last we met, we had left off with having made the 2 bearings, and we had gotten partway through these. I made the other 2 that I hadn't finished of what are going to become the corner prongs. Okay. And so these were done out of, in this case, 22 gauge sheet. John talks about using 24 gauge, but I think that tends to be good for smaller stones. So I went up a little bit because I'm using a fairly large stone. I would certainly not go much lower than 24 gauge. I don't think I'd go any lower than 24 gauge on something of consequential size. And one of the tricks that, so in his drawings on page 110, he's got examples that are actually flat-sided. One of the tricky bits of doing the cushion variant of a square or rectangle is that we have to get a little tiny bit of curvature in here. And so I had just started to put that curvature in. I didn't want to bore you guys with me mangling the metal until it got a curve. But what we're looking for is a tight fit so that there's no gapping, because we're going to solder that in place on both sides. So this is going to be, all 4 prongs are going to be of sheet, unlike the teardrop we did last session, which had a combination. You could use a combo. It's just going to be a little unbalanced looking, as my take, if you do it on something, a square. On a rectangle, it might be interesting to have one side sheet and one side triangle or opposite corners. But to me, this is, unless you've got a perfectly calibrated square, it's going to show as off center. If you were to say do outside corners, diagonal corners in square and diagonal corners in prong, but maybe, depends on the stone. Functionally, they work similarly, and you could maybe do a double prong and something to add a little vim and vigor to it. One of the things I like about this particular shape is I see a lot of people, and I have not done it. I have not tried it yet because I tend to not work that big scale for it very often. I've seen people make a very heavy bezel and set stones into the top of each prong, which is quite lovely. It's just nothing I've tried yet, but I really like the concept of it. And that's going to be a slightly different setting, where it's going to be counting on having a heavy gauge and pushing in to get you'll cut a spot for the corners of the stone, and the pressure of pushing it in is what's going to hold the stone in place. So those tend to be done in a setting that's platinum or a low carat, medium carat gold, so that it doesn't want to flex out. And that gives the post some meat to work to support any stones that you set down into it. But I suppose if you got thick enough silver, you could do it that way too. You just don't want movement is the whole thing. So with that in mind, we are getting ready to set up our lower the way that we see him set it up on the bottom right column pictures on 110. So I'm going to hop on over, or actually before I do the hop on over, I'm going to do one more thing. So we made these prongs a little longer than necessary. I barely made them a little longer. I did a little too much filing. But one of the things we can do is trim a smidge off of what's going to be the bottom edge to make it a bit of a point. I don't want to take too much off because I know I'm close. Point that it'll help push it down into the fire brick a little bit. So give yourself a little more material to work with than I left myself. I'd rather do a steeper point than this so that I can really make sure it's upright and stable in the fire brick. You can do a fire brick. You can do, what's the other squishy pad that always reminds me of asbestos, but isn't? There's it looks sort of cottony.
Magnesium.
What is it?
Magnesium block.
Magnesium. Yes, thank you. The magnesium block. I'm going to turn up my volume because I'm having a hard time hearing today. Oh, no wonder. I'm way down on volume. Okay, so we're going to hop on over to the bench. And for new folks on the call, feel free to hop in with questions or comments along the way, either in chat, which I'll only see when I'm looking up at it and not staring at a bench block, or we're small enough numbers that it's perfectly okay to hop on with a question on your mic. Okay, and my brick needs cleaning again. So what I'm doing at this point is looking for a soft-ish spot that's not coated in flux on my bench block so that I have a place I can actually push these into. And then I'm going to use the cut down end and just set it up. One of the reasons I like fire brick is that you can set things into the material. You could also use some stabilizing T-pins, steel T-pins if you wanted. I'm gonna go opposite sides, so I'm really pushing against myself. And the goal in this is to make sure things are upright and tucked in close to your material, and that they are going to be solderable. You know, they have to be close enough, tucked in and lined up, that when you solder them, they stay where you want them. I really wish I'd left myself more material, because I'm not getting this down deep enough to be really confident that it's stable. But we can also do a light tack solder on this first pass, as long as the slice down the middle that we've set up is actually aligned with the corner of the bearing. I'll draw that when I get back to the other bench. Going to use a bit of flux, because the paste flux will help keep it stuck to it once it dries and help keep it positioned. This is still a little rotated out. See if I can line these up a little cleaner. And we're going to use hard solder per John's recommendation, that we use hard solder for as much of whatever we're doing as possible on these constructions. Yeah, that one's not staying. I may have to, so his goal with this is that we do it all in one pass, meaning we get all four corners soldered as a set. I don't know that I have the dexterity to get them all done. I think I'm going to cheat and leave one corner out so that I can get these better positioned. And if you find you're struggling with this a lot, or you don't have the fire brick or something equivalent that you can push this down into, you can grab it with those tweezers or another pair of tweezers, you know, cross-locking tweezers, and treat it more like we were doing the regular prong settings. It's just a little awkward to get it into place. Of course, it's awkward to do it this way too, but it's a little better. Okay, so I'm a little happier about how those are positioned, and not having the last one in place means I can get my torch in there. Swap over my goggles. And just swapped out my tank, so my torch just wants to go nuts right now. I'm going to see if I can get this well under control. I may have to play around with my pressure settings a little bit. There we go. So just gently heating, making sure that those don't shift on me. And as with so much of what you guys have seen me do in other rounds of this, I'm using my pick to do solder positioning and working just inside. Super easy to get hot because you're making a little oven between the prongs. This one's actually potentially going to be easier with tweezers. I think I'm going to switch gears because I'm not having enough control. My little tweezers, there we go. Not having enough control getting it right where I want it. And the smaller your setting, the harder this positioning is going to be. So I'm using wire solder for this. Could use chip, either one. And I'm trying to just get everything tucked in right where it won't really actually be visible, but also would let that a position that lets it flow to both corners of the prong, because I want it to be well connected all the way around the corner. Keep trying to move away, don't you? two of these I like the position on and one I don't, so I may just do two and then reposition. Okay, so I've got a tack weld here. I don't have it well, I don't have it close enough to make me happy yet. I've only got one of them well positioned. And if you're a fan of paste solder, that works too. Just be careful not to overdo it. Super easy to get too much solder going.
Yeah, it's not gonna come.
Getting very hot, yeah. Say again? Was there a question? Yep, I've stuck to my own block, so I've got to reposition. Opposite sides. Was there a question? Or did just somebody have their mic on? Okay, tucking that back in again. And just like with the other prong settings, we're doing this carefully enough that we can make corrections midway through. So we wouldn't try to solder both the top and the bottom bearing concurrently. We need to make sure we've got our bottom bearing framed and upright, which it isn't just yet, but it will be soon. And then we can reposition. My goodness, this sheet is heating up like gangbusters. Okay, I must not have as close a fit as I think I have, gang. This is fighting hard against the soldering gods. Oh. There we go. Okay. It's two, a little bit messy. I'm going to quench it and reposition just because I don't like the tilt that I've got on these guys. Make sure that I'm actually getting these straight and upright. Okay, so two are positioned. And keep in mind that we're going to be spreading them outward towards the upper piece, the upper bearing. So putting it back into its little notches so that I can add back the other bearings, or prongs rather. Going to be one of those fight me days, I can tell. I've decided that soldering days that go awry are actually hammering days. Usually works out pretty well when you switch gears like that. Unfortunately, none of these settings require a lot of hammering. Oh, you're just being a pain in the butt, aren't you? I may end up moving over to the tweezer method just because it's fighting so hard. Let me get this last position in. There we go. Thanks. Okay. A little bit of a leaning Tower of Pisa going on here. There we go. That's where I want to try this again. So the corner making the curve on this makes it a little more challenging than it would if it were a flush square. Because if I don't have an absolute perfect match, then I'm not going to get the corner lined up and connected the way I want. And in the course of that, I managed to melt the top of one of my prongs. We're going to pause and see if I've done so much damage that I need to make another prong, as I suspect I do, because I didn't give myself enough material. Pop back over. This is the delight that is teaching live. Wow, that's really mangled. So if we have these all expanded out at the angle that we're supposed to be at, just pulling them outward to fit this. Question is, will I have enough material to actually set the stone without the collet poking down below? Oh, I may. Let's see if I can trim enough off of that. So what I'm looking for is, this is what I melted. I want to see if I snip this right below where I melted it. I'm going to solve it because I'm going to mangle it if I snip it. Bear with me. All right. Take two. Right. So the question becomes, do I have enough material to push over the stone when it's in place, and enough material height, rather, that I don't push the stone poking through the back? And it's really a close call. I don't think I actually do have enough. Do I think I can do a repair on this? All right, so in the interest of what would I be doing if I were trying to repair this in an everyday situation, I'm going to once again try a removal of that prong that I just destroyed. If I can't remove it, if it mangles my frame too much, my bearing, then I'm going to have to do a lot more than just make a new prong. But let's see what we can accomplish. See if we can take that off. And in doing that, I'm going to use my cross-locking tweezers as kind of a blocker to the heat so that I try to avoid overheating the other two prongs, which are successfully in place right now. Pops a little flux on there to help it flow. And my goal is really to just get it flowing enough that I can pull the prong off. So I have my tweezers at the ready, and I don't put the steel super into the heat, but I put it near enough the heat that it warms. I don't want it glowing red. I just want it to be not so cold that it steals the heat from the flowing prong once it starts to go. There we go. So that is one of the things that you can practice when you position something wrong, when you realize you melted something, as I just did. Being able to take material back off and swap it back out is a really valuable skill. I'm going to toss this in the pickle because it's gotten ferociously grubby at this point because of the work that I've done. And I want it clean in order to straighten everything out and reposition. So we start our day with some minor failure points. Any questions while I'm awaiting that pickling about what you would tackle if you ran across a problem or what we're looking to do? Or any of our settings thus far?
What size torch head would you use for something like this?
So used to be that I would, oops, picture's frozen for you, Deborah. Anybody else getting frozen picture? No, I think it might be just Deborah. Better now? Okay, good. So what size torch I used to use before I started taking classes with John versus what I would use now are two different things. I was early on taught to use a fairly small torch tip for doing this kind of delicate work. John uses a 1 or bigger for most of his projects. Now, he also, the majority of his more recent work is not jewelry scale. It's large scale object wear, you know, vases and chalices and things like that. But he prefers the bushier, softer heat to the focused heat. Now, if I were working in gold, I would be doing a very small, you know, I use either an oxyacetylene, Smith Little or something like that, because gold, you want your heat focused exactly where you're working because it doesn't transmit the same way that silver does. But in silver, you're going to actually have less likelihood of melting if you're using that broader, bushier torch. So I stick with a 1 as my, I would say I do 95 to 98% of my solders using a 1. And only when I'm down to doing a very tucked in somewhere jump ring or connector or something, do I go down to a smaller tip. But depends on what you're working on and what materials you're working with.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Other questions? All right. I'm going to work on making the replacement prong while we wait for that to finish pickling, which means I need to get my one remaining prong back so I can see. Oh, I probably need to pickle this one remaining prong. This was 22 gauge. Scrapbook 22. Oh, that's 24. 22. Right, so I just need to, I'm going to make this one a little taller than I did the other ones because I should have done that in the first place. I trimmed too much. So let's see. And here's the trick, is finding out how wide I made it before. Right down the curve. Go ahead.
What gauge wire are you using for the prong?
The bearing is done in 16 gauge.
Okay.
And then the sheet I'm using in this case is 22. John says you could go and use 24. But I was a little reticent to do that on such a large stone. I wanted a little more material holding it in place. It's again, there's baselines and then there's depending on the scale of your piece.
Okay.
And also sterling, not fine, in this case makes a difference. So if I were using fine silver, I'd go heavier. Or more to the point. I probably would avoid using fine silver for prongs. Too easy for it to bend. Let's see, it's taller than I made the last one. Trim some stuff away. So I'm just doing my rough cut with the shears. For those of you that have been with me for a while, you know I am a lazy jeweler and will do everything I can to make my process a little faster. And then I want to make sure that I've got my middle line marked. Ash bang. My goodness, I may need to go back to bed today. All right, so making a replacement is a little trickier than making the original batch at once, because I had a strip of material that I was using for all of it. So I was able to make just 4 in a row off of the cut that I'd made before. I'm just marking my center line so that I can then take the saw and cut down the middle. This is that 2/3 of the way through. Keep this in the screen. Yes, still in screen. And in this case, because I'm not doing a full-on square, I'm only going to do that triangle cut in once I've got a mark. If I were doing a sharply cornered square, I would probably start with my triangle and then end on a final pass with the square file. But for the sake of this, I don't want it to do a sharp 90 degree. I want it to do a gentle curve around the corner. Rip this. I should have done it while it was open and while it was long. As with our cornering on bezels and other things besides the walls we're making now, remember that you're going to switch directions so you get an even depth from both sides. Oh my goodness, today is doing me in. Guys, I'm just not getting the grip I need. Let's try it in a ring manual. I'm in a ring clamp. There we go. That's what I needed. When in doubt, change tools. Find the right tool for what you need to do. Again, going about 2/3 of the way through to get this bend. And then I'm going to start with parallel jaw pliers. If I can figure out where I put my parallel jaw pliers, there we go. And do the bend. When using the parallel jaw pliers, we line it up on the line that we've just filed, just to the side of it, and we're pushing our material forward. In this case, it's so small, I'm probably going to have to hammer it a little bit. But where's my, there we go. But don't try to bend it with the pliers per se. What you're trying to do is use the pliers as a lever and get it to go against the material, like you might against a corner block. All right, so we get a nice sharp bend, and the parallel jaw gives us a nice alignment. But now you get to see one of the boring making it round pieces. I'm making it curved pieces because our square is not truly square. So I need to give this piece some curvature. And after some playing, what I found was that using a pair of half round pliers to give it back a curve. So opening it up with the half round instead of with a pair of flat jaw pliers, and then bending it back on itself once it has that little curve is what got me to a closer curvature match. It does take a little cleaning up because I don't have a pair of parallel jaw half rounds. I wish that would be wonderful. I only have round and flat. So I'm going to be using a combination of pliers to get that bend sort of straightened out while also keeping some curvature to it, if that makes any sense at all. Basically just bullying the metal into the curve I want it to be in, and then trying to make sure that it's fairly consistently folded up and down the edge, because when I use the half round, it sort of gets a little dip in the middle. And again, checking against the stone to see how I'm doing. That's a much better fit, but still not quite there. See how it does against the metal. Oh, it's actually quite good against the metal's curve. And I'm checking both ends of the prong that I'm making to make sure that I've actually gotten a fairly consistent curvature down the piece. Because if I've got it wide open at one end and then not at the other, I'm going to have a hard time getting it positioned once I've attached it. So let's see, that's feeling pretty good. A little bit too open. Close that down a little more. And in the book, John notes that if you have cut far enough that you feel it's necessary, you can do a solder line down this. Because this isn't a square cut, it's such a gentle curve, I'm not feeling the need to do that solder line. But if I did, I would go onto the bench and put a little bead of hard solder in there and flow it down what I've cut. Less curve on this end. And there are probably multiple other ways to achieve this kind of curve. Because it's such a soft curve, I could have possibly gotten away with not doing the saw down the middle, or I could have put a curve into the metal and then sawed down like a half tube kind of situation. Oops, check against the metal though. Nope, too far closed again. So this is why I didn't bore you guys with this 4 times over and tried to do most of them while in between the sessions. It's this fiddly little back and forth. And each stone and each corner even is a little different. There we go. That's making me happy. All right, let me see if my other one is cleaned up under the pickle. Sort of. Yeah, hot. Clean enough, I think. All right, so we're going to test and see that it is in fact still proportional. I've got a little bit of warping in my piece, partially because of that pulling out that I did where I tried to angle things a little better. I'm just going to try and straighten that a little. And now that it's clean, I can see that I didn't get quite as clean a flow as I wanted. So I'm going to try and get those to flow a little more when I'm working on this. And you can see from that we're going to need to do a lot of straightening and tweaking to get this to really be angled well relative to the lower bearing. So I'm going to get my other corners put on and then do a little cleanup on the corners. Like good. And oops, except that I'm still wider. I forgot to file down my edges. So I need to trim this out a little bit. handy dandy grip. Take down enough material to match the others. Each side. Good. And I'm gonna give myself a little bit of that angle that I need to help stick it into the block. Hop back over. And see if we can get it this time through. So let's try where we had it. Yeah, that extra little bit of height that lets me push the last prong in better makes all the difference in the world. And in the course of trying to get these last two, you can see I really want to get this one a little bit cleaner and upright. My goodness, this does not want to flow where I want it to flow today. I'm going to do a little bit of stick soldering. See if I can get better control over where the solder is flowing. So I've got 3 prongs I'm happy with and 1 that I'm not. It's this little guy that just wants to tip away from its bearing, which probably means I didn't do as clean a job of shaping. Yeah, get rid of you because you're not behaving well. Ugh. Some of that solder off of there. Reposition. So what's happening on this, I don't know if you guys can see it closely enough, is that I was getting connection over here, but it wouldn't flow through, which likely means my curve didn't quite line up with the rest of it. Let's see what we got here. So I got to file off a bunch of that excess solder that I managed to leave tucked in there. And this is again going to need pickling. I'm going to pickle it first, and then I'm going to solder off, and then I'm going to file stuff off. And since this one, go ahead.
Rachel, when you switched from to the stick soldering, I noticed you didn't put any flux, any more flux.
It still had flux in there.
Okay.
What I was doing was feeding solder in. So let me actually draw, because it would have been really hard for you guys to see the frustration that I was hitting there. So let me draw for you what was going on from a top view. So we have this, and this is the wire.
Switch your camera.
Oh, thank you. So we're in here, and we've got the prongs, if well seated, are coming right along here, right? If not well seated, which I think is the case on the other one, I think what I had was this little gapping right here. And so I was getting, because if we were to look at a side view of it, we're trying a very hard connection. This is our round wire, and this is our sheet, and there's very little actual contact between the two, right? So we're trying to get solder to basically fill in this area. Oops, I'm right in my light, so you guys can't probably see that. There we go. So we're trying to fill in, let me redraw that one. There's this tiny little connection point right there where they touch, because the sheet is flat and the wire is round. This might be an easier exercise if we had chosen to use square wire for our bearings, for example. But because of that, what I'm trying to do is get enough solder to flow. And while it's true that solder doesn't fill the gaps, it kind of does in certain circumstances. So in this case, having the solder run along the channel here is what I was trying to do. And getting the beads in there, what I was discovering when I had all 4 positioned, and what you guys probably could see was how hot red the sheet was getting, right? Even though not terribly different of a gauge from the wire, part of that was caused by this being the wire is resting on the brick and getting a lot of heat, so it's getting the frame less than it's hitting all these upper areas. So I was heating a little bit above it, and it was heating the air around here more. So I was overheating my corners. And part of it is that this makes a little convection oven. So if I'm heating here, the heat is bouncing and creating heat buildup inside of the little container, even though it's got gaps. You know, if you're ever making a box or a large bezel, you'll see this happen too. It's that it's swirling around and overheating everything that's inside, because it's basically acting as a reflector of all the heat and the hot air that's moving around. So that's why I'm getting so much hotter on these upright pieces than I was on my wire, which makes it not want to flow as well as I want it to. And so by stick soldering, what I was doing, you'll notice that when I was stick soldering, my heat source, I was aiming down and back, right? So I was aiming my torch just below the wire, trying to keep this connection point hotter than this section up above, right? And by doing that, while feeding the stick solder in from this direction, I was trying to get it hot enough that it would run and flow, and it did. It's just the reason I use stick solder as a last resort is it invariably, as we'll see when I show you how much solder is in that one corner, floods the heck out of things. Because the only time you touch stick soldering down is when your temperature is up to the point that you think it's going to melt. And that's a really hard thing to judge. And if you do it too soon, you're going to get a big ball of solder balling up at the end of the wire. So that was why I was feeding the solder in. Could I have paused and put more flux on? Yeah, but it already had, I could see that there was still some of the reddish glassiness from the flux I'd put in place. So I didn't really need to. That give you some answers on what's been going on my more macro scale at the bench?
Yeah, it looked mighty red. Yeah.
It was mighty red. I don't like it getting that red. And it's part of why my inclination is to use tweezers to hold things rather than this bench block thing. Or to make a heck of a lot longer prong so that I can actually really get the heat going. I mean, sorry, so I can really get the flow going above and below it. Like if I had more height so that my wire bearing was resting off the block a little bit more, I would have had more circulating heat. So this ugly thing has an awful lot of solder on it. And I'm going to trim away. As in several of our other mistakes along the way, I would not be trying to recover from this for a finished piece. This is beyond my level of comfort for how much I'd clean up. But I'm going to try and get you guys, how do you get there from here? Because we do now have reasonable connectiveness. Ugh, just lots of gunk in here. On 3 of our 4 corners. So I'm going to see if I can make this recover. And the answer may be no, but we're going to try. So I'm cleaning off excess solder with a file so that it's not fighting when it goes to flow the next time. I have a feeling that I'm going to make this one over again regardless, just because I won't be happy with the end product, but I want to see how far we can make this go. Get the concepts of positioning everything down. And things that we can do that we could have done to make that connection cleaner, because it is that challenge of flat surface against round surface, is we could have filed a little bit in each corner flat to give ourselves a little more surface area. Could have used the square wire. This would actually be a really elegant setting in a square wire. And I need to clean out the excess in the actual prong that we made. Part of the reason that when we're doing the round wire prongs in the basket settings that we do that little notch is it gives us that extra surface area for solder to wire contact. And we don't get that from this flat sheet against round wire situation, which makes it, as we can see, a little more challenging to get the connection we want. Soldered on. Okay, and because I'm manipulating it so much, I need to check and see where I'm fitting. I definitely don't have enough curve left, so I'm going to put some curvature back in. Especially since that was probably the cause that I didn't follow my curve as closely as I thought I was. Go around it, just get it a little squared up again. Too much. Definitely not liking how this is looking. And I just want to see what we're going to look like once we get them all connected. Then we have to widen them out. And this is going to go inside of that. The second layer should, knock on wood, be a little easier because it'll be held in by the compression of the four sides. And then it's a matter of making sure we keep it positioned well relative to the height we need. I think I'm going to give that another go. See where we land. Okay. What do we care about on this corner? My bit of solder that I can use sheet solder. Excuse me, that I can use stick solder if I need to. More pieces of wire over here. And see what we get. For those of you that weren't with us last session, the first portion of this is the second half of last session's video. And I've got to remember and check whether I actually managed to load the file last time. I thought I had, but maybe not. If not, it'll go up shortly after this session. Okay, once again, watching the heat. Let me get some flow from behind. Go. See, as soon as you get a clean fit, same basic rules apply. Clean, clean, clean. Clean metal, clean fit. Things like to do what they like to do. Excuse me. So we're going to have some manipulation of this to get it positioned the way we need. We're going to have to open it out, but we're on the right track on this one. I'm going to put it in the pickle for a good long time. And I'm going to go grab last session's Pear Setting out of the tumbler. So give me 30 seconds to go dig that out of that material, and I will be right back with you. We'll try and set a stone while that one cooks. Okay. All right. Let's see whether this is nice and shiny and bright yet. Obviously, when setting, we're going to have it attached to whatever we intend to use it on before we are ready to go. Oh, goodness, there's a lot more foam in here than I meant, so I got to go rinse it off. Hang on a sec. All right, so we have our relatively cleaned up and finished. You guys would make sure it's nice and highly polished before you're setting your stones. All I did between last time and this time was a little bit of trimming and filing, and then I took down the front of the sheet portion of this prong into that little angled bit. Okay, we're going to finish that up because I didn't trim it all the way. I wanted to show the various steps. Stone, there we go. So this is a rough fit, and I'm still not thrilled. It's ever so slightly off center on one of the prongs, but it's a decent fit, and we actually have enough overhang that we can probably avoid the drilling in of the front prong, of the front divot, but I don't want to chance it. So the first thing that I'm going to do is get a good sized ball burr and take out the front little bubble here. So right in this corner, aiming at the top of the prong, I want to take a ball burr and make a little divot that goes into the metal, but not through to the other side. And what that guarantees, what that improves the chances are, there's no guarantee in life. What it will improve is the likelihood that you won't chip off the front end of the stone. So let's see what we got for a decent size ball burr. Is that going to fit in there? That's a little big. I just want enough space that if there is downward and forward pressure that pushes the tip of the stone into that corner, it's not hitting metal, it's hitting air. And this is true of any corners that are true corners. I'm not sure we need to do it on the cushion that we're working on right now, because we're pushing in equally from the sides and there isn't a point per se.
Rachel, do you have a measure that you could measure that ball burr?
Sure. I mean, it's going to depend on the size of your setting and the size of your, but let's see what
But just give me an idea.
Yeah. For this, I'm going to be going, and I could go smaller. I wouldn't go bigger than this. Looks like I'm going to be, what's my setting? This is a 2.53. Is that right? It must be a 2.55. 2.55 millimeters is where I'm headed with this particular combo of angle of the stone. And again, not super deep. I'm just trying to get spacing that when the stone is pushed down and in, it can have a little breathing room. And I'm going to try and focus this right in the join of the wire and the sheet in this case. Watching to make sure that I don't drill through, yikes, through the sheet. Okay, that looks like enough. So it gives me, let me see if I can find a way to indicate how much I did in here. See if I can get a pink dot right where I did it. So that's the space that I went into, down and back enough that if I push into the corner, it's not gonna, the stone is gonna have a little leeway because we're pushing in from the side and in from the side. And then the other thing that I'm going to do, and I do this on some stones and not others, it depends a little bit on how it sits on the bearing, is I'm going to see how high it's lifted off and whether it's a nice even lift all the way around. In this case, it looks like it needs a little bit of help resting on the seat because let me see if I can describe this in a drawing. There's a bit of curvature to the belly of the stone on this one. Some stones are a little more flat faceted and some have a belly. So if I'm looking on the stone, and I've got my table, and that. Sometimes I have a fairly clean line down, and other times I get sort of this kind of action, right? And so once again, depending on where my setting rests, if I've got round here, it's trying to push away, right? The curve pushes at an odd angle in it, so it wants to slip back and forth. So what you can do is come in here and file a little bit of an angle on there to get it, or a little bit of a curve to get it to sit a little more cleanly around the edge. And the tricky thing is that this is at sort of weird angles to get in, to reach in. So I tend to use my favorite file, the crossing file, the one that I can't live without. I'm going to use a small crossing file, and maybe at the tips I'll have to use a barrette file, but something, ooh, I've got an even smaller than I thought crossing file. So this is, I can never remember the term for this particular version of files, but this gives me a little bit of access, and it's about the angle I'm going in on this. I want to still give it a good clean seat. I don't want to take away too much material, but I do want to take away material at the right spots, which is wherever that curve tries to push the stone away from the metal. I want it resting as cleanly as possible. And then same thing in this front end, and I think I do need to go to the flat file in the front. And I'm not taking a huge amount of material off, but I'm trying to take material off in a way that it consistently and evenly follows the line, meaning I don't have it curved in some places and flat in others. And what that gives me is just a little more stable rest. And it also acts as a little bit of a, it allows me the stone to push a little farther forward in the setting than it was doing. It was sort of sticking its butt out the back of the setting a little more than I wanted it to. So by putting that in there, I can rest it a little more centrally on this, right, plonk down right on the setting where I want it to go. So tiny adjustments like that can make a big difference to how it rests and what it looks like from the sides and everything. So when this is set, I'll have a little bit more of a consistent resting between the along the wall of the stone, along the belly of the
Can you
stone.
move your hands up a little?
Sorry. Yep.
There, thank you.
Let me actually bring this over to the good camera so we can do a close-up, because you'll see what I mean about the rocking that it's trying to do. Zoom in for you. Let me get my chat window out of the way so I can actually see what I'm doing for you guys. Okay. So when it has the round and nothing else, what's happening is this particular stone wants to
Bring
sit.
it, Rachel, bring it over a little bit more.
Is that good?
There you go. Yeah, thank you.
So when I haven't done that filing, it wants to sit. I'm going to fake the action that was happening. It wants to sit sort of pooched back towards the back of the setting. As soon as I have that ability to keep things a little more on one plane, that I've made concessions for it, it's going to sit a little more centrally on the stone. And so what I'm aiming for is a consistent height here all the way around. And now it wants to sit there fairly naturally once I let go of it. It doesn't try to scoot its way back like it was, or too far forward, which could also be a problem. If it goes too far forward, it's going to come, the end of it is going to come off of the setting. I'm sorry, I wish I had a darker stone for you guys. Let me see if putting black paper behind this helps. Does that make any difference? Or is it still too subtle to see? We can zoom in any further.
That's good.
Yeah, there we go. Okay, so let me do that action again. Before we put things in, it was pooching its butt out the back, right? Sitting sort of diving down to the tip. So you can see that it's stuck up. Its nose is diving down here and its rear end is diving up here. That little bit of filing means that I can get it to sit pretty naturally at a consistent height. Questions about that? Okay, back to the setting prep. All right, so on our last session before, we prepped 2 different ways to fix our prongs, to ready our prongs. One was by hand with the files, and one was using the setting burrs. Those were on round stones. There are absolutely ways that you can use burrs on a teardrop setting. If you get really good hand control. The one that I understand most pro setters, which I do not claim to be, most commonly they're using a heart burr, doing 1 prong at a time, and usually like angling and positioning it under their microscope so that they can get exactly the cut in that they want. My hands are not enough control right now. I have too much problems with dexterity at this point in my life. So I cannot make that cut cleanly. I just don't have the stability. I won't get a straight line. So I'm going to go and use the hand tools, which I can get a little bit more control over and stop myself before I get terrible at, before I cut something that I don't mean to, which is harder to do when you're cutting in with a burr. But absolutely, either way is legitimate. Whatever tool does the job without injuring you or the product, I'm a fan of. In this case, we're trying to use mostly techniques that John has specified. And we're gonna cut it in by hand. And we may also have to cut a little bit more away from the top, because now that my piece is sitting so nice and level, well, maybe not. No, I think I've actually got a pretty good height on the front, on the sheet prong. I think that's going to fold over where I want it to. So what I need is to figure out, I'm going to use the Sharpie marker and blacken the inside of my prongs like we did on the round setting. And then we will we'll score where we want where they should hit the edge of the stone. So when we are resting the way we intend to be, up towards the front, we're going to mark. Make sure that's nice and flat. Mark it. And I'm going to refer back to earlier when we were doing the round one, back on what page was he on when he talked about this? Filing in the prongs. Where did he talk about that? Page. Oh, page 102. He shows us that we are marking, but then we put in our notches below the mark, right? The mark is where it should be when it's leaning over the stone. And we're going to put our groove. In this case, we're starting with a round file to cut notches just below the mark that I've just made. So I'm going to use my itty bitty, super tiny files and go in just below. Make sure that you are positioned in such a way that you're cutting facing the stone. What I mean by that is that we aren't off to one side of the prong, but we're dead on towards the middle of the stone with where we're putting our notch in. So I'm just doing a starting mark on each of them. And I'm going to check it from both sides, making sure that I've filed evenly. And then we move on, just like on, so we just done step number 2 of what you see on the chart on 102. And we're going to move to a crossing file to take the material above it down a little bit. I'm going to draw that one larger so that we can all, those of you, if you don't have your book with you, you can see what we're talking about. So we have our prong. And we had a mark here, which was where it was going to hit the top of the stone. And we've just put in a round notch. And now we're going to use the crossing file to take this material down so that it becomes this shape taken away. Right? And that's going to give us the clean fold over point. So my itty bitty crossing file. And this time I'm working from that circle point up towards the notch, towards the mark that we made. I always have to remind myself to slow down when I'm filing this kind of thing, so I keep it clean. I think I need to go in a little bit more in my rounds position. I think it went deep enough. Okay. More material off, up. Mark. The other one. I need a bigger crossing file. One thing I know I have to be careful of when I'm doing filing in close quarters where there are prongs on the other side is I have accidentally filed the opposite prong when I'm tucked in on the back side. So just be really cognizant of where your file is touching down on the whole piece. Okay, so let's see if I can mark this one up so you guys can see what I've done. So hopefully you can see a little bit of that. Right where the pink is, that's not showing up well. Wait, under there. I need some close up cameras. Hang on a sec. So the pink represents what I've taken away. I've done that on both sides. You can really see it from there. And that gives me enough flex. Sorry, guys. Small camera. There we go. That'll give me enough fold over flex. And then I'm going to trim back the upper prongs once I'm confident that I've got enough push from the prong where I want it. So let's see. Are we missing any steps? Proper burr size. Yeah, we're not going to get the click that we aim for when we're doing a round because our front corner is the point, but we should get a little bit of pressure when we do our first push forward. Now I'm going to use, I would come in and I would clean up all the interior of the markers and stuff like that before I did this setting, but you can clean around it. I'm going to be using a bezel pusher that has the channel down the center of it that helps support the prong. And I'm just going to rough set to make sure that I'm still doing okay with the positioning of everything. I may need to cut down a little lower than I did. This is still a little upper wobbly. Yeah, so what I'm seeing is that little butt wiggle that I was showing you was trying to happen when I didn't have things carved out. If I don't go a little further down the prong, I'm going to have it it's still going to try and slip backwards up. So I'm going to trim this a little further down from where I was to give myself a little tighter fit.
Using the round file?
Yeah, because it's the round end of it that I'm trying to get a little closer, and then I'll go back and clean the line with the with the crossing file. I just need to bring the original divot a little further down the prong to get a true alignment. Here's my crossing file. Makes me a little happier down there. Got to be real careful. I'm not going all the way through the material. And you don't want to have too many attempted pushovers because eventually it'll weaken at that point. Because it's work hardening as you do it and it's getting thinner as you file it. But that's going to make me a little happier about where it positions itself. So I'm pushing in at the base to make sure that it's actually up, bumping up against the stone. And then I'm going to start to push a little bit over, but not fully set. So only once I've got it up and in. And if we need to, for pressure, we can push against the bench pin. It's a little easier with a round stone than it is with another size, another shape, because we don't have as much opposite sides action. But what I'm trying to do is get the base of the prong in a little further before I push it over. If I need to, I can bring in the pliers to straighten it a little. I think we're okay. So I'll push it over at the bend point where it starts to hold it where I want it, but I'm not doing my final pushover until I've got things sized and started to put down the other prong. Okay, so I have a little more space than I'm thrilled with in the front, even once I'm pushing down, but we're going to see how that goes. I think I'm debating whether I need to trim a little bit more away from the front of this. And I think the answer is no. I think I just need to start pushing the prong forward, the prong that's made from sheet. So this is going to behave just like the corners of our bezel settings.
Rachel, I'm not seeing where you're pushing on that point.
Oh, so I'm pushing on the back end of the V. And
Okay.
I'm just, say again?
I said, okay.
And
Yeah,
I'm
better.
a little bit in and a little bit up and over. And I'm going to work my way into the V to see if I need to trim any more away, because I may have to do that sawing. Remember the technique, those of you that were here when we were doing the cutting in the corners on a regular step bezel, shoulder bezel, we either had to file or we had to use a fine saw blade and cut down the interior to trim this back away and get it a tighter fit. And so we're at that point where I've got a rough fit, and I'll bring this back over to the close-up cam so that you guys can see what I mean. Where are we? Let me get the black paper. It definitely looks better on that. There we go. Is that in focus for you guys, or do I need to back out a little bit more to get focus? That
I
easier
think
to,
it's focused.
That's good.
so
Yeah, that's
it's so shiny on the stone that I'm not sure we're going to differentiate. Let me see if blackening the setting will help a little bit.
So Rachel, you never pushed on the point of that stone, correct?
Oh, not on the point of the stone. No, not
Right,
no.
yeah.
Pushing on the material to either side of the point. Yeah, we want to avoid putting pressure. This isn't a terribly sharply pointed stone, but any downward pressure on a sharper one would certainly start to try and chip it. So what I've got here is this little pinch. The black is what is our silver, and hopefully you can see right towards the front. There's a little pinch happening. That's the excess material. If I could have judged a little more closely, I could have risked filing my angle a little more steeply and taken more of that away, but then I could have overfiled too, and I'd have had nothing to work with to hold it in. So in this case, what I'm going to do is the technique that we learned on the earlier chapter, which is I'm going to get out an 8/0 saw blade, the finest one I have, and I'm going to cut right down the middle of that onto the stone, but not actually cutting the stone. So it's a careful sawing activity. And what it does is it is acting as a tiny file for us, taking away small bits of material, so that we can then push a little bit further down into our setting. I guess I'm using a 7/0 because I don't have an 8/0. So it's gonna behave as if we were just filing smidges of material out of the way and let us further push the fold down. And if we do it well and cleanly, nobody will see without looking under a scope the line that we've cut down the middle. Okay, so let's see how my eyesight is doing today with the close-up stuff. And again, watching out for the stone, watching out for the prongs on the other side. Slow and steady wins the race. On something like this, I'm prone to do only a downward sawing and then a lift to give myself a little bit more control. So I'm just taking away material right at that center point, and then I'm going to press. Oops, wrong pusher. I'm going to press in a little bit from each side to get it snugger again. And then I'm going to go back and saw again once it's closed together. Getting right down that middle line. Which is a little tricky on a point. Would I want to do this sawing technique on an opal? Nope. But on something like an amethyst, it's not too rough. You can be very cautious. Sometimes you got a little bit of scrap material you got to peel out of the way. You may have to touch it up a little bit with a set of files. But for now, it's tiny closure, then saw. Tiny closure, then saw. And this will also be what we'll be doing once we get around to the other setting we're starting, the emerald cut, if there's too much material in the way, although the curve on that one may be enough that we can't tell. I mean, that we don't need to cut in. A little bit more than that. And so I'm being very, very careful to get lined up exactly with where the 2 points make the V. Because that's critical to getting this to be a clean fit. It's getting trickier the smaller I get on my lump of material. Again, think of your saw blade as just a really itty bitty little midget file for the purposes of this exercise. And let me burnish off the Sharpie mark so that you can actually see what kind of a point we've got here, because it's a little hard to tell. Push the edges. Okay, back over to the close-up bench. So what we've got now is because we've been using the tiny saw blades rather, is that the seam line down this point in the middle is so negligible and so pressed together from the pressure I've put on setting it that it's invisible. And when I mean, it's not literally invisible. If I look at it up close, I can see where it is right now. But by the time I finish burnishing and filing the little bits of edging that are still there from the saw blade, it'll be invisible. And we've got this lovely little V creation. Whoop, I'm off camera, sorry. This lovely little V creation at the tip of our setting that is a nice counterbalance to the prongs that we'll now trim down.
Very
Okay.
nice.
Yeah, so I really like, I'm enamored of that fitting that he does where you've cut the angle back to your corner. I like it a lot better than a solid, consistent, you know, the two variations are you fold, you fold, you fold, you fold, and you have the same exact thickness all the way around, or this variation where you're angling back down before you start that fold, and it makes a really elegant finish to the piece. Let me draw that out in case that ramble of mine was not articulate enough. So the version where we cut the angle back down instead of leaving it, start this again. So we've got our V that we've made, right, at this height, and it's all level right now. Where we cut it, which is what I did between sessions so that we wouldn't have to sit here and watch me filing away. When we cut it back down to a shorter height here than here, we get this very elegant chevron effect at the top of the stone. Right? If we don't do that, then we get a consistently thick look, but on the point of a teardrop, that makes it a very heavy front setting compared to the lightness of the prongs that we're going to have at the back side. So I'm very much a fan of that file it back at an angle business. I think it looks much nicer and at once both modern and also sort of there's a Victorian effect to it. So I've got definitely more pushing down and burnishing on this front, but before I finish that, I'm going to just make sure that I haven't pushed myself out of my position on the back. This is actually fairly solidly held here, but I want to go back and push in a little bit more on the prongs to make sure they're down and determine where I'm going to trim them to, which doesn't have to be terribly high up. I think I'm going to just go partially into that first facet along the edge. And so make this consistent. trim some of this off. Trim the right spot though. Trim at the right mark. So now I've got a rough cut of my prongs, and I can do a little bit of tweaking of the position of them to sort of alleviate a little bit of what I didn't like about where one of my prongs is a little far back from where it should be. And I can play with that a smidge before finalizing this, but it's not going to get corrected fully no matter what I do other than rebuild. But I can sort of push one further out and one further in to give it an effect of being balanced. I can do a little more trimming. Make that look a little more even. And then all of the things that we learned on the earlier session about how we can finish these prongs still apply. We can do a knife edge point, which might be nice to sort of give that linear effect that goes pointing at the chevron that we've made at the front. We can use a cup burr and finish it round, which is pretty traditional. We can file a knife edge into it. We can file it square and flat and blunt. All those versions that he has back on page, where's our page of page 107, he shows some of the basic prong shapes. Play with those or other versions of them. Once again, if we had worked with square wire, that would give us different options. But at this point, using the barrette file that we cleaned the edge of, remember, we always, when we're working against a stone, we always want that fully cleaned, fully polished barrette edge so that there's no scratching of the stone going on as we shape our prong. We would do this final cleanup. And then we will have a lovely setting. We polish the last of it up, you know, do the bits of cleanup that we need to do with probably with some rubber wheels, any touch up you have to do, and voila. Questions?
No, looks really nice.
Yeah, well, when it's polished up, it's close. Got a little bit of futz that I got to do to get it positioned exactly where it needs to go, but I think it's pretty darn close. And it's sparkly. It's a very sparkly stone. Okay, let me get the other stuff out of the pickle. And what are we doing for times? Get that out of the pickle and see whether we can do our second tier. Pickle is finally heating up enough. Good. Try to speaky off. All right, so and last we saw this little guy, we had a somewhat wonky alignment because of all that rework I had to do. So one of my bearing edges is up a little from the rest. I'm gonna have to play around with that a little bit. And there we go, that's a little better. And we have to make sure that we're going to point all of these out the right way for the second bearing to go in. And that's a fair amount that I'm going to have to pull it out because it's tucked in to the angle of the lower bearing. So I'm going to gently manipulate opposite sides to open them out, hopefully equal amounts. And then go to the other side. And I got to be careful not to destroy the curvature that I worked to put in. I'm doing a little bit of flattening on these, which I need to be careful of. And I'm being a little thrown off by the one that's taller because it makes me think that they're not even, when really, once we get these set up and positioned, it will be a lot more even. So this layer is going to do a little bit of holding itself in place by the nature of having made a smaller bottom bearing going up to the top bearing, because it can only squish down so far. But that doesn't guarantee it won't move on us while we're soldering. And we have to be cautious to make sure that we're not going so low that the coulette pokes out the back. So, oops, back here. So when we've got it in there, I need to make sure it's level, it doesn't poke out the back, and we're just squeaking on the edge of the stone sticking out, and that we have an even distance all the way around. And that's the super hard part, is making sure that we're getting consistent height. And so John suggests putting a U of some kind of metal in between. Where's his picture on that one? On page, I know we had a good setup for this. Up at the top of page 114, he talks about using a spacer and copper or brass wire that will be the right thickness that you oxidize before you put it through. He's not recommending steel. I wonder whether a titanium spacer would be a good call in this. I have used steel. I've used like a set of T-pins in between. You could probably use pencil lead. Anything that won't fuse to your pieces is worth considering, I guess. But I don't have much other than brass and copper. So I'm going to go with copper scraps if I can get this into place enough. I'm not sure I have thick enough copper is the problem. Now let me mark where I want this to rest. That is the lowest I want it to go. And then I'm going to use that first marker point to mark all the other positions on the inside of the prong, so that I have a bit of a guide. So all I'm doing is scoring the same height up from the lower bearing on each prong to give myself an assurance that I'm going to have a level piece once I put it in place. Back up. And one of the things I'm finding iffy on this setup is that 2 of my corners fit pretty cleanly and 2 of them do not. So I've got to do more adjusting. One of my prongs is twisted a little bit, and that's creating part of the problem. I'd like to say that things look ugly before they look beautiful. That's one of the things I say a lot to students in class. But this one looks like it might be ugly and stay ugly. I'm definitely going to have to redo this particular style a couple more times before I'm happy with it.
I'm curious as to how you're adjusting it.
You mean, what movements am I making to make the adjustment? Or do you mean,
Yeah, and how do you know?
so the marks that I put down tell me that I want it at a specific height, and that's what I'm aiming for. And what I'm watching for is, let me see if I can draw this large. What I'm seeing from the top down, part of the challenge is this is not a perfectly calibrated stone, so it's a little off square to begin with. And what I'm seeing happen in my corners, one of them is sort of torqued out a little bit like that. So it doesn't want to follow the corner. And I'm pushing them outward and checking that again, the wire fits down the center and really has touch points all the way around. So this one is causing this one to go out of torque, because even if I fit these two corners, when it tries to go in here, it goes wonky on the opposite side. And all I'm trying to do is small movements, both down and, oops, where did I go? Both down and in. So I can get, like, these two sides are great. This side is not fitting well because this side is torquing. And if I can fix that, then all I'll have to do is close this one a little bit. It's a little too wide open. So I'm trying to twist towards the center that it's moving away from. That makes that corner happy. Okay, so now we're down to, this one is too open, so I need to close it a little bit more. Too much. That is too much. Do a little dance back and forth between rounding it and closing it. And this is one of those little adjustments that somebody who's done hundreds of this kind of setting probably does in their sleep. For me, it's not a standard setting I do. Ooh, but when it clicks, it starts to really click. So I've got really good fit on 3 edges. That just needs to come in a little bit more. And when it starts to fit, the height starts to come close to what I want it to be all the way around. So then it's a matter of making sure got it pushed down enough all the way around. So what I'm not liking is that as I push the corners out, or rather, what I'm not liking, because I didn't do it intentionally. Had I done it intentionally, I might have liked it a lot more, is that my base is getting some curves into it. My lower bearing is starting to get curved because I'm forcing the bottom edges in. So I'm going to try and embrace that and see if I have a small pair of half rounds. Do I? I'm going to try and embrace it and make that curve work for me a little bit more. I can find a pair of pliers that will get me in close enough. And try and make it a little more consistent, because the only thing that's irritating me about the idea of it is that it's not evenly curved between each section. And it sort of makes sense that this would be happening as we arch out away from the center. I'm trying to think what I would do differently to make sure that I didn't have that curve if I didn't want to embrace it. And that's probably, I probably would go with square wire on this particular design. because it's gonna fit its corners better. Let's see if I'm now too far open. Okay, so I've got positioning that I'm not happy with that corner. Boy, they. I keep being happy with 3 corners and then the 4th bugs me out. So I'm going to take a page from John's earlier portion of the book, and I'm going to tack down 1 corner of this with solder so that I'm not, because right now I'm fighting a lot of the movement of the metal. And so I'm going to tack down the corner that I use as my starting point on the measurement, and then we'll reposition. Even though he has in the book that he'd like us to be able to do it all as 1 setting, I know my limits. I'm not going to get this that way. So I'm tacking this 1 corner, and then we'll use that to hold while I position the other corners. It is certainly okay to say that is not within my capabilities at this time. I do it on a regular basis. And sometimes it's just that a given technique is not one that's going to work for your hands, for your approach to soldering. Soldered in. Okay. All right, so we have 1 corner tacked. Just to put all my regular tweezers away somewhere. 1 corner is tacked, and I can pop back to the bench. And now I have more oomph to push it down into the positions that I want it in. And I can check my heights relative to that 1 position that I've already got locked in much better. Simply because, oops, I'm not on the right bench for you guys, block for you guys. So that simple change from trying to tack all 4 of them at once to having it held in a way that I can now manipulate it when I need to makes all the difference in the world. Now I can actually get the corners moved into their appropriate positions and get a snugger fit. So I've got 2 really good fits and 1 that's trying to get away. So because I've done that tack down, I don't think I'm going to need to put something between the layers. I know famous last words, but we'll find out if I'm right. Because I can pretty much get it positioned where I need it because that one side is locked in. And check my measurements, see how we're doing. Too high. So. Okay, here goes nothing, gang. I have one too many pair of goggles in my bench setup right now, so I keep putting on my goggles on top of my goggles. Let's see. A nice little bit of heat. That's our corner that's already been done. And the top level in terms of access and overheating, it's a lot easier to get access to it than tucked down inside of the piece. Yet another reason why I recommend if you first start a style of setting like this, that you start with larger stones to give yourself easier access. It can be much more frustrating working with small stones. Because you're going to be more likely to melt yourself into a corner. Oh, way too much solder on that one. Okay, so I needed to do a little bit of stick soldering to encourage one half of one of the prongs. And I needed to do a little bit of reflow where I had tacked it originally to get it finished flowing. But there we have the mess of a basket setting. And we're gonna pickle this and see whether it improves with pickling. Because this definitely is a little distorted from where I'd want it. And may yet be recoverable with judicious filing and other cleanup. But those are some of the ways around the angles and the settings. It's a lot of fiddly bits. Any settings at all will have a portion that is fiddly, and it's usually the more complicated the shape of the stone, the more likely it is to be about those corners or the curves that you're trying to match, or that the stone isn't the same on both sides. You know, we're about to do a marquee, and that one, it could, could be a perfectly cut marquee, or it could be a little bit wobblier belly on one side than or wobblier curve on one side than the other. You're gonna obviously try to find stones that are good and go from there. But this is what we're trying. We're testing all of his different settings and seeing what we learn from each of them. And I'm learning a lot from this one, not the least of which is that I really, really like this cut. I like a cushion cut in a square, and I want to come up with variations on this one. But I'm going to go about it a little differently than he's got in the book. I'm not going to try and be that person who can get all 4 of them set at once. Because it's just not in me. It may be in me after I do another 100 of them, but right now it's not. And so I'm gonna back down from his approach and do what works for me a little bit more on this one. And I'm definitely gonna make more of them because there's so many variations we can do if you just simply angle, go from wide to narrow on each of the prongs. That gives a different look to it. If you put that V at the top that we're talking about, that makes it more chevron-like, or if you go the opposite direction, you'll have to go a little bit wider on your prongs, but you could go with a point that goes up and points into the center of the stone. If you do a rectangle, you might add some side prongs in addition to the corners. There's all kinds of variations on this one, so I'm excited to do more with it. I'm just not terribly excited about this first attempt at it, so. Any questions on what we've gone through? And did I miss anybody in chat? My chat is behaving badly again. Okay.
Good class, thank you.
Sure. Yeah. I think probably just time-wise, well, I'm not a fan of this half finished in one, like doing one in one session or half in one session and the other half in another. It feels like all of us, including myself, forgot a little bit about what we had already done on this setting. So I think rather than trying to start the marquee and only get partway through, we'll say that is it for the teaching / running through of things of today. But does anybody have anything to show off to me or to the gang, please? I need more show off things, guys. I need to know that you're out there making art after these sessions, even if it's not the art that I'm showing you. What are you working on? Anyone?
I'm just doing some piercing lately.
Okay.
So, 'cause I don't have the kind of patience you have.
So,
So,
piercing is a great back plate for, even if you're just improving your bezel. Let me pop it up so we can see.
well, let's see if I can.
Ooh, that's a lot of piercing. And some nice
Yeah,
curves coming out.
they're earrings.
Nice.
I found that there are a lot of files like in Etsy and stuff like that for like leather earrings and stuff like that, and they're great for piercing.
Huh. And they don't wear out quicker because they're softer metal, or
Well,
they?
no, I mean they're just the design.
Huh.
They're,
Oh,
they're just
patterns,
design
pattern.
files.
Not
And,
filing files, pattern files. Got it.
Right.
Very
Right.
cool.
And so I found a lot of they have leaves and flowers and all kinds and geometrics and everything. So
Nice.
I've been playing with a lot of those because piercing has kept me as sane as I'm ever going to get lately.
So I want you to consider the effect of piercing behind a transparent stone, right? A back plate doesn't have to be just cut out or, just an empty space or a filled space. But man, you get the right stone and it had like an agate that has some beautiful transparent and translucent color combinations, and you cut out the right pattern and you've built a landscape behind the agate. So embrace it in the stone setting practice too, not just the pieces by themselves, which look fantastic.
Yeah, this is another this is a
Wow.
leaf one.
That's fabulous. Absolutely. And you put a little curve in it, I see, to get the leaf.
Yeah, I
Love it.
adapt them a little bit so
Yeah.
that they hang better. So
Yeah, very nice.
that's what I've been doing because I
Very
don't have
cool.
the patience to do corners like you do
So
on stones.
the thing I'll say about if anybody decides to do some more backplate cutting out, one of the most common questions is, do I pierce it before or after I put the bezel on? And the answer is yes. No, so what I mean by that is it's going to be very dependent on the pattern you're cutting out, and your ability to precision solder. Because it is far easier. Let's say we're just taking a basic cabochon bezel. It's far easier to solder down a bezel wall to a solid plate than to a pierced one, because you're going to risk wherever your thinnest area of metal that you pierced, that's the risk point that you're going to melt it and break it open while you're soldering down the back plate, or that you're going to be ever so slightly off the position that you designed for yourself. That's what I hate most, is if I've really carefully pierced something out and then my bezel slides a 1/4 millimeter to the left and it looks off center. But the problem is you cannot access all parts of something you want to pierce necessarily when there's bezel in the way. So it's going to depend on the end product you're going for and when it's possible to actually pierce. So plan your design in advance and do the piercing at the last possible minute that you will still be able to reach it with a saw and file. And it's usually the filing that gets you on that. So if there's tiny cutaways in corners, man, those are hard to get to on their own. But when you add a bezel in the way, really problematic. But I'm a huge fan of the back of your work having as much excitement as the front of your work.
Yeah.
So give it some thought. Thank you for showing those. Those are beautiful.
Sure,
Anybody
thank you.
else have anything they want to share? Okay, going once, going twice. Still time to register for my class and get materials and so on. And I will see you guys in, what is it? Do we have 3 weeks between now? No, 2 weeks from now. So I will see you next on the 19th, at which point I will hopefully have either completely redone the setting we did today, or I will have cleaned it up so that it looks like I redid it, or both. I may try both. And let's see, we will probably do the marquee next. And maybe if there's time, we'll skip back to the crown setting that we skipped. Because I'm feeling like I need to mix it up. I'm trying not to skip ahead because I'm very excited about the final, I think it's the last setting in this chapter, which is the slotted card setting. That's a super exciting one and very challenging for me. So I'm looking forward to failing miserably and then succeeding again. So gang, thank you as always for visiting.
Thank you.
I'll see you in a couple weeks.
Thanks, Rachel.
Thank you.
Bye all.